I'm the big boss. Take a week and you're done, the CEO's nephew announced at the acquisition meeting. I felt the blood drain from my face as 15 years of dedication were dismissed in seconds. Everyone stared at this 20-something newcomer who'd just threatened my career at Westridge Technologies. In that moment of stunned clarity, I reached into my blazer pocket and handed my business card to the buyer's CEO. He glanced at it, then looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition. His unexpected laugh cut through the tension. No one knew this confrontation would change everything. Let me back up and introduce myself. My name is Jan Wilson, and until recently, I was the senior sales director at Westridge Technologies, a mid-sized software company that specializes in supply chain management solutions. I joined Westridge 15 years ago as a customer service representative. Fresh out of college with a business degree and more ambition than experience. Back then, the company was still finding its footing in the industry, with barely 30 employees working from a cramped office space that smelled perpetually of coffee and desperation. Harold Westridge, the founder and original CEO, took a chance on me when I pitched him ideas about improving our client communication protocols during an all-hands meeting. I still remember his bushy eyebrows rising in surprise when I, the newest hire, raised my hand. "You've got guts, kid," he told me afterward. "But more importantly, you've got good ideas." That was the beginning of my journey. I moved from customer service to account management, then to sales, where I discovered my true talent. I could connect with clients, understand their needs, and translate our technical capabilities into solutions they could grasp. Within 5 years, I was leading my own sales team. By year 7, I had been promoted to director, managing our most valuable client relationships. My crowning achievement came 3 years ago during an economic downturn that hit our industry hard. Companies were slashing their software budgets, and we were feeling the squeeze. I had been cultivating a relationship with Morrison Group, a Fortune 500 company that would transform our client portfolio. After 6 months of presentations, demonstrations, and negotiations, I secured the deal, the largest in company history. That contract single-handedly kept us afloat during the recession and propelled us into a new tier of industry players. Harold never forgot that. He made a point of acknowledging my contribution at every quarterly meeting, mentioning how the Morrison Miracle, as he called it, had saved jobs and set us on a path to growth. Harold became more than a boss to me. He was a mentor who trusted my judgment and valued my input on strategic decisions. "You know what makes you special, Jan?" He once told me during a late-night strategy session. "You never forget that behind every contract is a person making a decision. You sell relationships, not just software." Everything changed 6 months ago when Harold announced his retirement. At 68, with health concerns and a desire to spend time with his grandchildren, no one could blame him. The transition plan had been in place for years. His son, Thomas Westridge, would take over as CEO. Thomas and I had always maintained a professional, if distant, relationship. He had worked in various departments over the years, though never in sales. He had an MBA from a prestigious university and experience at larger tech companies before joining the family business. I was optimistic about working with him, confident that my track record would speak for itself. My team was solid too. Melanie, my assistant for the past 4 years, was efficient and fiercely loyal. My development team, who customized solutions for our top clients, respected my ability to translate client needs into technical requirements. And then there was Scott Anderson, my colleague who headed the marketing department. We had started at Westridge around the same time and had been through the trenches together. When rumors about a potential acquisition first started circulating, I wasn't particularly concerned. Our company had become an attractive target after several years of solid growth, and with Thomas now at the helm, strategic options were naturally being explored. Given my position and client relationships, I assumed I would be involved in any serious discussions. The first hint that something was off came during a leadership meeting 2 months after Thomas took over. He brought along a young man named Bradley Pierce, introducing him as his nephew, and saying he would be observing our processes. Bradley looked barely out of college, with designer clothes and an arrogance that seemed at odds with his lack of experience. During my presentation on quarterly sales projections, I noticed Bradley whispering to Thomas and smirking at certain points. When I checked my email later that afternoon, I found a calendar invitation for an all-hands meeting scheduled for Monday morning. The subject line read simply, "Important announcement regarding company future." A knot formed in my stomach as I closed my laptop and headed home for the weekend. Unable to shake the feeling that something significant was about to change, I arrived at the office 30 minutes early on Monday, hoping to catch Thomas before the meeting to get some insight. The parking lot was unusually full for that hour, and I noticed several luxury cars with rental tags that didn't belong to any of our staff. Walking through the main entrance, I sensed an undercurrent of tension. Small groups of employees huddled near the coffee machine, conversations stopping abruptly when others approached. The conference room was already half filled when I entered. In addition to our management team, there were 6 men and women in expensive suits whom I didn't recognize, sitting together near the head of the table. Bradley was among them, looking far too comfortable. He gave me a dismissive nod when I entered. "Morning, Jan," Thomas said as he rushed past me, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "Grab a seat anywhere. We'll start in 10 minutes." I chose a chair near the middle of the table, watching as more colleagues filtered in. Scott arrived and sat beside me, his expression carefully neutral. "Do you know what this is about?" I whispered. "Not specifics," he replied, not quite meeting my eyes. "But change is coming." At precisely 9 o'clock, Thomas called the meeting to order. He stood at the front of the room, Bradley hovering at his side like a shadow. "Thank you all for being here today," Thomas began, his voice stronger and more authoritative than I'd ever heard it. "I have exciting news to share. After careful consideration and extensive negotiations, I'm pleased to announce that Westridge Technologies will be merging with Pinnacle Innovations." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Pinnacle was a major player in our industry, at least 4 times our size. "I want to assure you that this strategic merger will position us to compete at a higher level and accelerate our growth," Thomas continued. "To facilitate a smooth transition, I'd like to introduce you to the Pinnacle executive team who will be working with us over the coming weeks." Thomas gestured to the unfamiliar faces, introducing each with their impressive titles. The last person he introduced was a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and sharp eyes. "And this is Richard Carter, CEO of Pinnacle Innovations." Richard offered a polite nod to the room, his expression revealing nothing. "Now, I know you all have questions about what this means for your roles," Thomas said. "To address this, I'd like to invite Bradley Pierce to walk us through the transition plan." Bradley strode to the front, practically bouncing with enthusiasm. "Thank you, Thomas. As some of you know, I've been brought on as the transition director to oversee departmental restructuring during this exciting time of change." I felt my heart rate quicken. Transition director? This was the first anyone had heard of such a position. Bradley clicked to the first slide of his presentation, which showed a new organizational chart. My eyes scanned the boxes, looking for my name, or at least my position. It wasn't there. The entire sales structure had been reorganized under a client acquisition department with Bradley's name at the top. "As you can see," Bradley continued, "we're modernizing our approach to align with Pinnacle's market-leading strategies. Traditional sales methods are being phased out in favor of a more aggressive digital acquisition model." I felt eyes on me from around the room. Bradley was essentially dismissing everything I'd built over 15 years as outdated. "Our data shows that personal relationship management, while quaint, simply doesn't scale efficiently in today's market," he said, looking directly at me with a small, satisfied smile. For the next 20 minutes, Bradley outlined what he called his modernization plan, systematically dismantling the strategies and relationships I'd cultivated. According to him, our existing clients would be transitioned to automated account management systems, and our focus would shift entirely to new customer acquisition through digital channels. Throughout his presentation, he repeatedly deferred to the Pinnacle executives, particularly Richard Carter, with comments like, "As I'm sure Richard and his team can attest," and aligning with Pinnacle's proven approach. Richard's expression remained unreadable, though I noticed he wasn't nodding along like the others. When the meeting concluded, I approached Thomas in the hallway, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Thomas, can we talk for a moment? Privately?" He glanced around nervously before nodding and gesturing toward his office. Once inside with the door closed, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. What just happened in there? My entire department is being dismantled, and this is the first I'm hearing about it? Thomas sighed, not meeting my eyes. "Jan, I understand this is difficult, but the merger requires certain efficiencies. Bradley has experience with these kinds of transitions." Experience? He looks barely out of college. And since when is he your nephew? Everyone knows you're an only child. Thomas had the decency to look embarrassed. "It's a term of endearment. Bradley and I go back to my MBA program. He was an undergrad when I was finishing my degree. He's shown real promise in his consulting work. So you've handed over the reins to a consultant with no history with our company or our clients? What about the Morrison account? That relationship took years to build." "Bradley has already had preliminary discussions with Morrison," Thomas said quietly. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. "Without me? Without even telling me?" "It was necessary to ensure continuity during the transition." "Continuity? You're replacing me with someone who has no history with them." Thomas stood up, signaling the end of our conversation. "I'm sorry, January. Much of this is out of my hands now. The deal is almost finalized." As I turned to leave, a document on his desk caught my eye, a contract with Thomas's name prominently displayed. I couldn't see the details, but the words "executive retention bonus" were clearly visible. "So you negotiated a golden parachute for yourself while throwing the rest of us overboard?" I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. "It's business, January, nothing personal." Over the next few days, the situation deteriorated rapidly. My team members were being called into meetings with Bradley and assigned to new projects without my knowledge. Melanie, ever loyal, kept me informed of whispered conversations and backroom dealings. "They're saying Bradley isn't even his nephew," she told me during a private lunch off-site. Apparently, they were in some fraternity together in college. Word is, Bradley's father is a major investor in Pinnacle. Even more disturbing were the calls I began receiving from clients. Morrison's procurement director, with whom I'd worked closely for years, phoned to ask about promises Bradley had made during an unscheduled visit. "He said we'd be getting customized inventory forecasting features at no additional cost," she told me. Confusion evident in her voice. "Is that something your team is working on?" It wasn't. Such features would require months of development and significant investment, something we couldn't possibly deliver at no additional cost. Then came the final blow. While passing the conference room, I overheard Bradley mentioning an acquisition integration meeting, scheduled for the following day with Richard Carter and other Pinnacle executives. I wasn't on the invitation list. They were systematically cutting me out of everything I had built. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by notes and emails I'd printed out, trying to make sense of the rapid changes. My dog, Cooper, rested his head on my lap, sensing my distress. I absently stroked his fur while reviewing the timeline of events since Thomas had taken over. The following morning, I arrived at work earlier than usual and went straight to Melanie's desk. "I need your help," I said quietly. "Can you tell me everything you've heard about what's happening with Bradley and Thomas?" Melanie glanced around to ensure we were alone. "It's worse than we thought. Bradley isn't just some college buddy. He's been promised the VP position at Pinnacle after the acquisition. And here's the thing. He's not Thomas's nephew at all. That was just a cover story to explain his presence while they set everything up." "How do you know all this?" I overheard Bradley on the phone in the break room. He doesn't consider administrative staff important enough to watch what he says around us." Her expression hardened. "He called you the old guard that needed to be cleared out to make room for his vision." The betrayal stung, but it also clarified my next steps. "Melanie, I need access to Bradley's meeting calendar and any documents related to the acquisition that you can find." She hesitated. "That's risky, January, for both of us." "I know. I wouldn't ask if it weren't important. But something doesn't add up here, and I think our clients may be getting misleading information." Melanie nodded slowly. "I'll see what I can do. Just be careful." Over the next few days, I embarked on a careful, fact-finding mission. I reached out to several longtime clients under the guise of scheduling regular check-ins, and what I learned was disturbing. Bradley had been visiting them, making extravagant promises about new features and capabilities that our technology simply couldn't deliver in the time frame he was suggesting, if at all. Through carefully worded questions, I learned that many of these clients were growing concerned about the discrepancies between what they knew of our capabilities and what Bradley was promising. "Frankly, Jan," said the CTO of one of our oldest clients, "if anyone but a representative of Westridge had made these claims, I'd have shown them the door. The timeline he's suggesting for these implementations is fantasy." Meanwhile, Melanie discreetly provided me with copies of financial reports that had been prepared for the acquisition. Reviewing them at home, I noticed that our projected revenue growth was inflated well beyond any realistic expectations, particularly given the limited development resources we had available. The valuation being used for the acquisition negotiations was based on these inflated figures. I needed an ally within the company, someone with technical knowledge who could help me understand the full implications. Scott seemed the obvious choice. We had been friends for years, having joined the company around the same time and risen through the ranks together. I invited him to lunch at a small cafe several blocks from the office. "Thanks for meeting me," I said after we'd ordered. "I've been trying to make sense of everything that's happening." Scott shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's a lot of change all at once. That's putting it mildly. Have you seen the projections they're using for the acquisition? The numbers don't add up, Scott. And Bradley has been making promises to clients that we can't possibly keep." Scott's eyes darted around the restaurant. "Maybe he knows something we don't. Pinnacle has more resources, more developers. Even with more resources, the timeline is impossible. And you know as well as I do that integrating our systems with theirs will take months, not weeks." I leaned forward. "Scott, how long have you known about the restructuring? About my position being eliminated?" He couldn't meet my gaze. "Jan, you have to understand." "How long?" "About 3 weeks," he admitted quietly. "Thomas brought me in early to discuss marketing integration with Pinnacle." The betrayal cut deep. We had been friends or so, I thought. "And you didn't think to warn me? What could you have done?" The deal was already in motion. "I have a family to think about, January. A mortgage. Kids in college." He finally looked up at me. "I'm sorry. I truly am. But I had to look out for myself." I nodded slowly, understanding even as the hurt lingered. "I get it. Self-preservation is powerful." As we parted ways outside the restaurant, Scott caught my arm. "Jan, whatever you're planning, be careful. Bradley has Thomas's ear, and Thomas has everything to gain from this deal going through smoothly." Back at my desk, I turned my attention to researching Pinnacle Innovations, and particularly their CEO, Richard Carter. Unlike Bradley and Thomas, Richard had a reputation for integrity. Business journals described him as old school in his approach to client relationships, valuing long-term partnerships over quick wins. Under his leadership, Pinnacle had acquired several smaller companies, but notably they had a history of retaining valuable employees rather than cleaning house. This didn't align with what was happening at Westridge. If Richard valued relationships and institutional knowledge, why would he support a transition plan that eliminated the very people who maintained those client connections? Something wasn't adding up, and I suspected Richard might not have the full picture. I dug deeper into the acquisition details, reviewing every document I could access. A pattern began to emerge. Bradley was positioning himself as the central point of contact between Westridge and Pinnacle, controlling the flow of information. I wondered how much Richard and his team actually knew about our operations, our client relationships, and our capabilities. I needed more concrete evidence if I was going to do anything about this situation. Through Melanie, I learned that Bradley stored most of his documents on our shared server rather than his local drive. However, accessing those files would require help from someone in IT. I approached Theo, a systems administrator who had been with the company almost as long as I had. His daughter had interned in my department last summer, and I'd written her a glowing recommendation for college. "I need a favor, Theo," I said quietly after explaining my concerns. "It's not entirely by the book." He studied me for a long moment. This company was like family before all this acquisition business. Now everyone's walking on eggshells. He sighed. "What do you need?" "Access to Bradley's document folder on the server. Just for an hour." Theo hesitated, then nodded. "Come by my office after 6. Most people will be gone by then." That evening, with Theo's help, I accessed Bradley's files. What I found confirmed my suspicions. There were modified versions of our capability documents that exaggerated our software's functionality. Client communication drafts contained promises that directly contradicted our development roadmap. Most damning was a draft presentation for Pinnacle that misrepresented our client retention rates and growth projections. I carefully copied the most relevant documents to a secure folder and thanked Theo for his help. "Just be careful, Jan," he warned. "Bradley doesn't strike me as someone who plays fair." As I drove home that night, I made a decision. The acquisition integration meeting was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Though I hadn't been invited, I was going to attend anyway. Richard Carter deserved to know what he was really buying. The next day, I dressed with particular care, choosing a navy blue suit that projected confidence and professionalism. I arranged my hair in a neat updo and applied minimal makeup. Today wasn't about vanity, it was about being taken seriously when I walked into that room uninvited. I timed my arrival carefully. The meeting was scheduled for 1 o'clock in our largest conference room. I waited until 5 minutes after the hour, when everyone would be settled but the substantive discussions wouldn't yet have begun. When I pushed open the conference room door, the conversation inside immediately ceased. All heads turned toward me. Thomas's mouth fell open slightly, while Bradley's face flushed with anger. Richard Carter, seated at the far end of the table, merely raised an eyebrow. "Jan," Thomas recovered first, his voice strained. "We're in the middle of a private meeting." "I can see that," I replied calmly, walking to an empty chair and sitting down. As senior sales director responsible for our largest client relationships, I thought my input might be valuable. Bradley stood up, his hands pressed against the table. "This meeting is by invitation only, and you were not invited." His voice carried a threatening edge. "In fact, given the restructuring we've discussed, your presence isn't appropriate." I met his gaze steadily. "I don't recall receiving any official notice about changes to my position." "Consider this your notice," Bradley snapped, looking around the room with a smirk. "I'm the big boss, take a week, and you're done." The room fell silent at his outburst. Even Thomas looked uncomfortable. The Pinnacle executives exchanged glances, clearly surprised by Bradley's unprofessional tone. "That's not how we handle personnel matters at Westridge," I said quietly. "But if we're being direct, I think there are some aspects of this acquisition that deserve closer examination." Thomas stood up quickly. "Jan, this isn't the time or place." "Actually," Richard Carter interrupted, his deep voice commanding attention, "I'm interested in hearing Miss Wilson's perspective." He gestured toward me. "Please continue." Thomas and Bradley exchanged panicked looks but sat down. Bradley quickly attempted to regain control of the narrative. He launched into his presentation about the fresh direction Westridge would take under the new structure. His slides were slick, filled with upward trending graphs and ambitious projections. "As you can see," he said, clicking to a slide showing client acquisition costs, "the traditional approach has become increasingly expensive and inefficient. He didn't name me directly, but his meaning was clear as he continued. Some in the organization have resisted modernization, clinging to outdated relationship-based models that don't scale. I watched the faces of the Pinnacle executives as Bradley spoke. Initially attentive, they began to show subtle signs of skepticism as he made increasingly grand claims about future performance. Richard Carter's expression remained neutral, but I noticed his eyes narrowing slightly at certain projections. Our analysis shows that by transitioning to an automated client management system, Bradley continued, we can reduce staffing costs by 60% while maintaining all existing client relationships. This was absurd. Our clients valued their personal connections with our team. It was a key differentiator in an increasingly commoditized market. I could feel my face growing warm with anger but maintained my composure. Bradley then presented a slide showing my department's performance metrics, but the numbers had been selectively chosen to paint a misleading picture. He had isolated quarters with slower growth while ignoring our overall trend line, which showed consistent year-over-year improvement. As we can see, he said with a dismissive gesture, the traditional sales approach has yielded diminishing returns. We're essentially paying premium salaries for relationships that are overvalued in today's digital marketplace. I bit my tongue, watching as he continued to misrepresent years of successful work. Each slide seemed designed to undermine the value of what my team had built, positioning Bradley and his proposed new structure as the solution to fabricated problems. With the new team I'm assembling, Bradley announced, his voice brimming with confidence, we'll implement cutting-edge acquisition strategies that will double our client base within 12 months. He clicked to a slide showing headshots of young professionals. I've already identified key talent, many of whom I've worked with previously, who are ready to join us after the acquisition. His college friends, I realized. He was planning to replace experienced professionals with his buddies. Throughout his presentation, I carefully noted each misrepresentation and inflated projection. The Pinnacle executives were asking questions now, some of which Bradley struggled to answer with specifics. Richard Carter, in particular, pressed him on implementation timelines that seemed unrealistic. These integration periods seem optimistic, Richard observed. Our experience with similar systems suggests the timeline would be closer to 18 months, not 6. Bradley waved away the concern. We have proprietary methods that accelerate the process considerably. This was another fabrication. Our development team had been clear about the complexity of any major system integration. As Bradley concluded his presentation, Richard turned toward me. Miss Wilson, you've been with Westridge for some time, correct? What's your assessment of these projections? Before I could answer, Bradley interjected. With all due respect, Mr. Carter, Miss Wilson represents the old approach we're moving away from. Her perspective is naturally biased toward preserving the status quo. Richard's expression hardened slightly. I believe I addressed my question to Miss Wilson. At that moment, I made a split-second decision. Instead of launching into a critique of Bradley's presentation, I reached into my blazer pocket and withdrew my business card. Standing up, I walked around the table and handed it directly to Richard Carter. Perhaps this will provide some context for my perspective, I said simply. Richard glanced at the card, then looked up at me with a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed a genuine laugh that momentarily transformed his serious demeanor. The sound cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Bradley looked bewildered and increasingly angry. Jan Wilson, Richard said, tapping my card against the table. Now I understand why this name seemed familiar when I reviewed the organizational chart. Everyone in the room was watching us now, confusion evident on their faces. Bradley attempted to regain control of the situation. Mr. Carter, if we could return to the integration timeline. Richard held up his hand, silencing Bradley mid-sentence. I think we need to reconsider some aspects of this transition plan in light of new information. He turned to me. Miss Wilson, would you be available to continue this conversation privately after we conclude here? Of course, I replied, relief washing over me. That's not necessary. Thomas interjected quickly. Any questions you have about our operations can be directed to Bradley or myself. Richard's expression was polite but firm. Nevertheless, I'd like to speak with Miss Wilson. In my experience, those who have built client relationships from the ground up often have valuable insights. He turned back to Bradley. Please continue with your presentation. We still have several points to cover. As I returned to my seat, I caught Bradley's glare. His face had turned an alarming shade of red, his composure cracking. In that moment, I knew I had changed the trajectory of this acquisition and possibly saved the company I had helped build from a disastrous future. The meeting continued for another hour, with Bradley struggling to maintain his confident facade. When Richard finally called for a short break before private discussions, I gathered my notes, aware that I had just made a powerful enemy but feeling more hopeful than I had in weeks. As the other executives filed out of the conference room for the break, Richard Carter remained seated, gesturing for me to stay as well. Thomas and Bradley lingered near the door, clearly reluctant to leave us alone. We'll just be a moment, Richard told them firmly. I'd like a private word with Miss Wilson. Thomas hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Of course. We'll be right outside if you need anything. Once the door closed behind them, Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me with interest. Jan Wilson, he said, tapping my business card against the polished conference table. You're the one who secured the Morrison Group partnership 3 years ago. I nodded, surprised that he was familiar with that deal. Yes. I led that acquisition. That was impressive work. Morrison is notoriously selective about their technology partners. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. In fact, they became a pinnacle client last year for our data analysis tools. Your name came up during our negotiations. My name? I asked, genuinely surprised. Morrison's CIO specifically mentioned the exceptional service they received from Westridge, citing you by name. He said, and I quote, if all vendor relationships were managed as well as Jan Wilson manages ours, my job would be much easier. Richard's expression grew more serious, which is why I was confused when I reviewed the transition plan and didn't see your name anywhere in the leadership structure. This revelation stunned me. All this time, I had been fighting to prove my value, while my clients had apparently been vouching for me behind the scenes. Mr. Carter. Richard, please. Richard, I continued. I believe there are significant discrepancies between what you've been told about Westridge and the reality of our operations and client relationships. He nodded thoughtfully. I suspected as much. Some of the projections in today's presentation seemed optimistic, and the dismissal of relationship-based client management doesn't align with our own philosophy at Pinnacle. He leaned forward. We value long-term client relationships above all else. It's the foundation of our business model. This was my opportunity. If you have a few minutes, I can share some observations that might be relevant to your acquisition decision. I have more than a few minutes, Richard replied. In fact, I'd like to continue this discussion over dinner this evening, away from the office. I suspect we both might speak more freely in a neutral setting. Just then, the door opened, and Bradley stepped in, not even attempting to hide the fact that he'd been listening outside. Sorry to interrupt, but Thomas wanted me to check if you needed anything, he said, his tone falsely solicitous. Richard fixed him with a steady gaze. What I need, Mr. Pierce, is the courtesy of a private conversation as requested. We'll rejoin the group shortly. Bradley's face flushed, but he retreated without further comment. Once we were alone again, Richard lowered his voice. I have concerns about some aspects of this acquisition. The numbers don't quite add up. And now I'm questioning the operational assessments as well. He handed me his own business card. My private number is on the back. Can you meet at 7 at the Capitol Grill downtown? I took the card, hope rising in my chest for the first time in weeks. I'll be there. Good. And if you have any documentation that might illuminate the discrepancies we've discussed, that would be helpful. I do, I confirmed. I've been gathering information. Richard stood, signaling the end of our private conversation. Then I look forward to our discussion tonight. He paused at the door. And Miss Wilson? I recommend discretion until then. The remainder of the afternoon passed in a blur of tension. Word of my confrontation with Bradley had spread through the office, and colleagues alternately avoided me or offered silent gestures of support. Melanie slipped me a note saying simply, "Whatever you did in there, Bradley's furious. Be careful." I spent the hours organizing the documents I'd gathered, creating a clear narrative that outlined the discrepancies between Bradley's claims and reality. I focused particularly on the client promises that couldn't be fulfilled and the inflated projections being used to value the company. At 6:30, I left the office and drove to the Capitol Grill, arriving a few minutes before 7. The hostess led me to a private booth in the back where Richard was already seated. "Thank you for coming," he said, standing briefly as I approached. I took the liberty of ordering a bottle of water for the table. I find clarity of mind essential for important discussions. After we had ordered, Richard got straight to business. "Tell me about your experience at Westridge, from your perspective. Not the polished corporate version. The reality." For the next 20 minutes, I shared my journey with the company, the relationships I'd built, and the success we'd achieved. I outlined the changes that had occurred since Thomas took over, and the circumstances surrounding Bradley's arrival. Richard listened attentively, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing me to speak uninterrupted. "And this claim that Bradley is Thomas's nephew?" he asked. "A fabrication, as far as we can determine. They know each other from college. The family connection appears to be a cover story to explain his sudden prominence in the company." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "And now to the heart of the matter. You mentioned discrepancies in what we've been told about Westridge's operations and projections." I retrieved a folder from my bag and placed it on the table. "These documents show the actual state of our development capabilities, client commitments, and financial projections, contrasted with what's been presented to Pinnacle." Richard spent several minutes reviewing the materials, his expression growing increasingly grave. "These differences are substantial," he said finally. "Particularly concerning are these promises made to existing clients." He tapped a document outlining Bradley's commitments to several major accounts. "These implementation timelines are simply not realistic." "No, they're not," I agreed. "And if clients believe they're getting these features and then don't receive them, we risk losing accounts we've spent years building, which would significantly impact the value of what we're acquiring," Richard concluded. He closed the folder and fixed me with a direct gaze. "I'm going to be frank with you. January. Pinnacle is still interested in acquiring Westridge. Your core technology is solid, and your client relationships, the ones you and your team have cultivated, are valuable. But not at the price that's been negotiated based on these inflated projections." Hope fluttered in my chest. "You're still considering the acquisition?" "With significant adjustments," he clarified. "And with a different transition team." He leaned forward. "I've already had conversations with several of your clients, including Morrison. They've confirmed what I suspected. The relationship with Westridge is important to them, but it's the people behind that relationship they value." "You've spoken to our clients?" I asked, surprised. Richard smiled slightly. "Due diligence is essential in acquisitions. I make a point of speaking directly with key clients of any company we're considering purchasing." His expression turned serious again. Those conversations painted a very different picture than what Mr. Pierce presented today. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now, I need you to prepare a comprehensive report on Westridge's actual status, client relationships, development capabilities, staffing, everything. No polish, no corporate speak, just the unvarnished truth." He checked his watch. "Can you have that for me by tomorrow afternoon?" "I'll delay further negotiations until I've reviewed it." "Yes, absolutely," I replied, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As we finished our meal, Richard asked one more question. "If the acquisition proceeds under revised terms, what role would you see for yourself in the combined organization?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on exposing the deception that I hadn't considered my own future. Honestly, I haven't thought that far ahead. My primary concern has been protecting what we've built and ensuring our clients continue to receive what they were promised." Richard nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of answer I hoped for. Too often in these situations, personal advancement becomes the priority. He signaled for the check. "I look forward to reading your report, January. And I suspect we'll be having more conversations about the future very soon." As we parted ways outside the restaurant, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. For the first time since Thomas had taken over, I believed there might be a path forward that preserved what mattered most about Westridge. Back home, I settled at my desk with renewed energy. Cooper curled up at my feet as I began compiling the most comprehensive and honest assessment of Westridge technologies I had ever written. Whatever happened next, I knew I had done everything possible to protect what I had helped build. I worked through the night, fueled by determination and strong coffee. By dawn, I had compiled a detailed report that presented an unvarnished view of Westridge, our strengths, weaknesses, true development capabilities, and authentic client relationships. I included financial data showing our actual growth trajectory rather than Bradley's inflated projections. Around 6 in the morning, I sent an email to several trusted team members, asking them to provide additional documentation that could support my assessment. Despite the early hour, responses began arriving within minutes. It seemed I wasn't the only one who had concerns about the direction things were taking. Sarah from development sent internal timelines showing the actual state of our product roadmap. Alex from accounting provided accurate cost analysis for implementing the features Bradley had promised. Even Scott reached out, offering marketing data that contradicted Bradley's claims about digital acquisition strategies. "I should have spoken up sooner," his message read. "Let me know what else you need." By noon, I had incorporated their input into a comprehensive document that told the true story of Westridge Technologies, a solid company with loyal clients and innovative technology, but one that couldn't possibly deliver what Bradley had been promising. As I reviewed the final draft, I realized I needed one more piece of evidence. I reached out to several of our key clients, carefully explaining that I was preparing documentation related to the acquisition. Without revealing too much, I asked if they would be willing to provide statements about their relationship with Westridge and their expectations going forward. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, I received testimonials from 12 major clients, all emphasizing the value of their personal relationship with my team and expressing concerns about the changes they'd heard might be coming. Morrison's CIO went further, stating explicitly that any significant changes to their account management would cause them to reconsider their contract when it came up for renewal. I added these testimonials to my report, then prepared a concise presentation that highlighted the key discrepancies between Bradley's claims and reality. I focused on business impact rather than personal grievances, emphasizing how the misleading information could damage both companies if the acquisition proceeded on its current terms. At 3 o'clock, I received a text from Richard asking me to come to Pinnacle's downtown office at 4 instead of our scheduled meeting at Westridge. This was unexpected, but I gathered my materials and headed out, telling Melanie I had a client meeting in case anyone asked. When I arrived at Pinnacle's impressive glass and steel headquarters, I was immediately escorted to a conference room on the executive floor. To my surprise, Richard wasn't alone. The entire executive team I had seen at yesterday's meeting was present, along with several others who were introduced as department heads. "Thank you for coming, Jan," Richard said, gesturing to an open seat. "I hope you don't mind the change of venue. But after our conversation last night, I thought it was important for my team to hear directly from you." I nodded, trying to hide my nervousness at addressing such a senior group unexpectedly. "I've prepared the report you requested, along with a presentation summarizing the key points." "Excellent. Please proceed." For the next 45 minutes, I methodically walked them through my findings. I presented side-by-side comparisons of Bradley's claims versus documented reality, outlined the actual state of our development capabilities, and shared the client testimonials I had gathered. "As you can see," I concluded, "there's a significant gap between what you've been told about Westridge and the actual state of the company. While we have strong fundamentals and loyal clients, The growth projections and implementation timelines you've been presented with are simply not achievable with our current resources." The room was silent for a moment after I finished. Then one of the executives, introduced earlier as their CFO, spoke up. "These discrepancies could materially affect the valuation we've been discussing," he observed, "particularly the timeline for integration and client expansion." Richard nodded. Precisely why I wanted everyone to hear this firsthand. He turned to me. "Jan, I should tell you that I've already spoken with several of your clients myself since our dinner last night. They've confirmed much of what you've presented here." I hadn't expected him to move so quickly. "You've been thorough," I said. "When tens of millions of dollars are at stake, thoroughness is essential." He glanced around at his team. "What's your assessment, everyone?" The discussion that followed was candid and detailed. The Pinnacle executives asked pointed questions about Westridge's operations, our client relationships, and the potential for growth under different management. I answered as honestly as I could, neither exaggerating our strengths nor minimizing our challenges. After about 30 minutes of discussion, Richard asked me to step outside while they deliberated. As I waited in a small adjoining office, I wondered if I had just talked Pinnacle out of the acquisition entirely. While that might save my job in the short term, it could leave Westridge vulnerable in an increasingly competitive market. 20 minutes later, I was called back in. Richard's expression was serious but not negative. "Jan, we appreciate your candor. It's rare in acquisition discussions to get such an unvarnished view." He glanced around at his team, receiving subtle nods from several members. "After considering your information, we remain interested in acquiring Westridge Technologies." Relief washed over me. "That's good to hear. However," he continued, "the terms will need to be substantially revised based on the realistic projections you've provided, and we have serious concerns about the current transition plan and leadership." One of the other executives leaned forward. "We've built Pinnacle on a foundation of trust with our clients. Overpromising and underdelivering isn't how we operate." Richard nodded agreement. "Which brings me to next steps. We'll be requesting a meeting with Thomas tomorrow to discuss our revised terms and conditions. Those will include significant changes to the transition team and post-acquisition management structure." "I understand," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what this meant for my future. "In the meantime," Richard continued, "we'd ask that you maintain confidentiality about this discussion. Return to work as normal tomorrow, and we'll be in touch after our meeting with Thomas." As I gathered my materials to leave, Richard walked me to the elevator. "You've taken a significant professional risk by bringing this information forward," he said quietly. "That kind of integrity is rare and valuable." I managed a small smile. I just couldn't stand by and watch everything we built get dismantled based on false promises. That speaks volumes about your character. The elevator arrived, and he extended his hand. "Thank you for your honesty, January. We'll be in touch soon." The drive home was a whirlwind of emotions. I had done what I believed was right, but the outcome remained uncertain. Would Pinnacle still proceed with the acquisition? Would Thomas and Bradley find a way to push me out regardless? And if the deal went through under revised terms, what would that mean for my role? As I pulled into my driveway, my phone buzzed with a text from Melanie. "Bradley's been looking for you all afternoon. Seems panicked." "What's happening?" I replied simply, "Tell you tomorrow. Stay tuned." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, knowing that whatever happened next, I had stood up for the truth, and for the company and clients I had devoted 15 years to serving. The next morning, an unusual calm settled over me as I drove to work. Whatever the outcome, I had done everything I could to protect what mattered. When I arrived at the office, Melanie was waiting with coffee and a warning. "Bradley's been in Thomas's office since 7, she whispered. "They don't look happy." "Thanks for the heads up," I replied, taking the coffee gratefully. "Let's proceed as normal." Throughout the morning, I focused on regular work, responding to client emails and reviewing proposals. Around 11, a company-wide email arrived announcing another all-hands meeting scheduled for 3 that afternoon. The subject line read simply, "Acquisition Update." Melanie appeared in my doorway moments later. "Did you see?" I nodded. "Looks like we'll find out what's happening soon enough." The hours crawled by, tension building throughout the office as speculation ran wild. Scott stopped by around lunch, looking nervous. "Any idea what's going on?" he asked. "Thomas canceled our marketing review without explanation, and I just saw the Pinnacle executives arrive." "Your guess is as good as mine," I replied, maintaining the confidentiality Richard had requested. Scott hesitated in the doorway. "Jan, about before. I should have warned you. I was thinking only of myself, and that's not the kind of colleague or friend I want to be." I studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We all make choices under pressure, Scott. What matters is recognizing when we've made the wrong ones." At 2:30, I made my way to the conference room, finding it already half filled with anxious employees. I chose a seat near the back, wanting to observe reactions rather than be the center of attention. Gradually, the room filled to capacity, with people standing along the walls when the chairs ran out. At precisely 3 o'clock, Thomas entered, followed by Richard Carter and 2 other Pinnacle executives. Bradley was noticeably absent. Thomas looked pale and subdued as he approached the podium. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. As you know, we've been in acquisition discussions with Pinnacle Innovations for several months now. Today, I have an update on that process." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "After extensive evaluation and due diligence, Pinnacle has decided to proceed with the acquisition under revised terms. I'll let Richard Carter, Pinnacle's CEO, explain further." Richard stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "Thank you, Thomas. First, I want to assure everyone that Pinnacle remains committed to acquiring Westridge Technologies. We value your innovative products, and most importantly, your exceptional client relationships." A murmur ran through the room at his emphasis on client relationships, which directly contradicted Bradley's dismissal of their importance. However, Richard continued, "Our due diligence has uncovered some discrepancies between the initial representations made to us and the actual state of operations." His gaze swept the room. "To be clear, we see tremendous value in what you've built here, but that value lies primarily in your people, your client relationships, and your technological foundation, not in inflated projections or unrealistic promises." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "As a result, we've negotiated revised terms with Thomas that reflect a more accurate valuation of the company. Additionally, we'll be implementing a different transition plan than what was initially presented." The tension in the room was palpable as Richard continued. "Effective immediately, Bradley Pierce will no longer be involved in the transition process or have any role in the combined company moving forward." Gasps and whispers erupted throughout the room. Several people turned to look at me, connecting the dots between my confrontation in the earlier meeting and this dramatic development. Furthermore, Richard said, "Once the noise had subsided, we'll be establishing a transition committee composed of key team members from both organizations who have direct knowledge of operations and client relationships. Their input will be essential as we move forward together." He gestured toward the executives beside him. "Over the next few weeks, our team will be meeting with each department to discuss integration plans. Our goal is to preserve what works well at Westridge, while providing additional resources to address challenges and expand capabilities." Richard's expression softened slightly. "Change is never easy. But I want to be clear about Pinnacle's philosophy. We believe in building, not dismantling. We acquire companies because they have value, and that value is diminished if we destroy what made them successful in the first place." As the meeting concluded, Richard asked several people to stay for a brief follow-up discussion. I was not surprised when my name was called, along with the heads of development, finance, and client services. Once the room had cleared, Richard addressed the small group directly. "You 4 represent the core operational knowledge of Westridge. We'd like you to form the nucleus of our transition committee, helping to ensure a smooth integration that preserves client relationships and technical capabilities." He turned to me specifically. Jan, given your extensive knowledge of client relationships and operational realities, we'd like you to lead this committee and report directly to me during the transition. I was stunned by the offer. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm committed to making this transition successful for both companies. Excellent. We'll schedule a formal kickoff meeting tomorrow. Richard checked his watch. For now, I have one more meeting to attend. Jan, would you join me for a moment? As we stepped into the hallway, Richard lowered his voice. There's one more thing I wanted to discuss privately. Once the transition is complete, Pinnacle will be creating a new position. Senior Vice President of Client Relationships, overseeing all major accounts for the combined company. Based on what I've seen and heard from your clients, I'd like to offer you that role. I struggled to maintain my composure. That's a significant opportunity. Thank you. You've earned it through years of building trust and delivering results. His expression grew serious. It's rare to find someone willing to risk their position to protect their clients and colleagues. That's exactly the kind of leadership we value at Pinnacle. As I walked back to my office after our conversation, I found Scott waiting outside my door. Congratulations, he said quietly. Word travels fast around here. Thank you, I replied, uncertain of his tone. I mean it, January. You deserve this. He hesitated. I've been offered a position in the combined marketing department. Not as senior as my current role, but it's something. I nodded, understanding his mixed emotions. You're good at what you do, Scott. This is a chance for a fresh start. I know, and I'm grateful. He extended his hand. No hard feelings? I shook it firmly. No hard feelings. The weeks that followed were intense but rewarding as we worked through the complexities of integrating two established companies. There were challenges, certainly, but with open communication and a commitment to preserving what mattered most, we made steady progress. Thomas left the company immediately after the acquisition closed, accepting his negotiated settlement and moving on without much fanfare. Bradley, I heard through industry channels, had taken a position with a startup, where his aggressive approach might be a better fit than in an organization built on long-term relationships. 1 year after the acquisition, Pinnacle hosted a celebration marking the successful integration. The combined company had not only retained all major clients but had expanded several relationships based on our enhanced capabilities. As the new Senior Vice President of Client Relationships, I had built a team that balanced traditional relationship management with innovative digital tools, not replacing the human element but augmenting it. During the celebration, Richard called me to the stage unexpectedly. I want to share something with all of you, he said to the assembled employees. 1 year ago, this acquisition almost went in a very different direction. Had it not been for Jan's courage in speaking up about discrepancies she observed, we might have proceeded under false assumptions that would have damaged both companies. He turned to me with genuine appreciation. Your intervention quite literally saved us from making a multi-million-dollar mistake. More importantly, you protected the client relationships that form the foundation of our business. For that, we are all grateful. As applause filled the room, I reflected on the journey of the past 18 months. From the shock of betrayal to the triumph of vindication, it had been a roller coaster of emotions and professional challenges. Yet through it all, one principle had guided my actions. Integrity matters. In business, as in life, standing there surrounded by colleagues old and new, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Not just because I had secured my own position, but because I had helped preserve something valuable for everyone involved, a company culture built on trust, respect, and genuine client service. In the end, the attempted coup by an entitled newcomer had failed not because of political maneuvering or personal connections, but because reality eventually demands acknowledgement. No amount of flashy presentations or inflated projections can ultimately overcome the truth of how a business actually operates and the real value it delivers to clients. That's a lesson worth remembering in any career. Authentic value always reveals itself in time. And those who build their success on substance rather than style will ultimately find their efforts validated sometimes in the most unexpected and satisfying ways. Have you ever faced a situation where you had to stand up for what was right, even when it put your job at risk? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a like, subscribe to hear more professional journey tales, and share it with someone who might need encouragement to speak truth in difficult circumstances. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and I wish you courage and integrity in all your professional endeavors.